Thank you. Okay. All right. So at this point now we can kind of return to the ideas that we talked about earlier when we were talking about the McGuire 2000 study, um, and look for the consequences of demand creation or induced demand with a regulated price. And as he notes, the general tests of demand inducement most often follow one of two approaches. In one approach, there's some exogenous shift in aggregate demand that occurs that causes physicians to respond. So, um, if any of you took econometrics and learned about instrumental variables, this is kind of an instrumental variable analysis, almost not exactly, but it's kind of the same idea, right? There's something outside of the system that causes people to increase their demand for physicians. So obviously, since it's outside the system, there's no way that it can be induced demand. It's something that's outside of the system, right? It's exogenous. So that's one approach. The other approach looks at what happens when regulators or insurance plans reduce the price for a specific service. Um, and really, this is still technically an exogenous shift in demand. It's just a bit more specific. It's either regulators or insurance plans. Okay, so we'll look at the first approach, exogenous shifts in aggregate demand. Okay, so this was done by Gruber and Owings in '96, and they studied differences between states in the reductions in birth rates in recent decades. So that's the exogenous shift, right? There, presumably there's no way that doctors are somehow causing the decrease in birth rates, right? It's exogenous. So for obstetricians in particular, what this means is a reduction in the demand for their services, right? If fewer people are having children, then obstetricians are going to see a decrease in the demand for their services. So it's exogenous though, right? It's outside of the system. And one response that Gruber and Owings look at is the frequency of cesarean sections compared to normal delivery. Okay, so that's one of the response variables they're looking at. So in terms of the birth rate, overall between 1970 and 1982, which is the period of time they're looking at, birth rates fell by 13.5%. Now, we should keep in mind that at the same time, the number of physicians per capita was increasing during this period, which makes the problem actually even worse, right? So birth rates went down, decreasing the demand for obstetricians. And at the same time, the number of obstetricians per capita was increasing. So you basically have a decrease in demand at the same time you're having an increase in supply, right? Or in other words, each individual physician's demand is even smaller because there's more physicians, right? So they took advantage of differences in the state to state timing and magnitude of the decline in birth rates. So the decline in birth rates kind of varied from state to state, and they used that data, they used that information to learn about the effect of those decreases in demand on the recommendations for C-sections. And they found something pretty interesting. They found that a 10 percentage point drop in fertility led to a 0.6 percentage point increase in this C-section rate, which is counterintuitive, right? Fewer people are having births, right? Fewer women are giving birth to children, but somehow the rate of cesarean section goes up. So that seems like it might be indicating some sort of induced demand, right? Primarily, I think because cesarean section is a little bit more involved and ultimately can generate more revenue for the doctor because of the surgical nature of it. Now you might be thinking, oh, 0.6 percentage points, that's not very big, but they were able to show that that small difference was actually very strongly statistically significant. And probably a better way to think about it is that if the average rate of C-section is about 20%, it means that a 10% change in birth rates created a 3% change in the rate of C-sections. So that's, 3% seems a little bit bigger than 0.6, but in any case, what's important is that the difference is statistically significant, right? It's not statistically the same as 0, even though 0.6 is pretty close to 0, right? So that's I'm sure there's probably been more studies since then that have looked at exogenous shifts in demand, but at the time of publishing of this book, I guess this was the only one. But I'm sure there's probably more now, now that we're 10 years later. All right. The next issue having to do with induced demand is thinking about the physician as acting as the agent for the patient, right? So you guys might know a little bit about the principal agent problem. So the idea really is that, well, first of all, it's a conceptual approach that comes from game theory, right? It's a game theoretical model. And basically the principal, which in this case is the patient, delegates authority to an agent, in this case, the doctor, and the agent is the one that makes crucial decisions. So it's the same with like sports players, right? Professional athletes have agents, actors have agents, right? So the point is that the agent is supposed to act on behalf of the principal and have the principal's best interest in mind. But since they're a different person, they often have conflicting interests, right? So that's the main issue here, is that principals and agents have different incentives, and on top of that, the principal cannot fully monitor the behavior of the agent, right? And so the agent might sometimes confront situations where the goals of the principal are in conflict with the goals of the agent. And this is pretty common. It's a very common problem in economics. Okay, so there's various arrangements that emerge in this type of relationship that are an effort to make the agent do what the principal wants. So this includes contracts, looser agreements, or maybe rules. But these are difficult to enforce in many, if not most, settings. And so Dronov and White provide a good discussion of the role of agency in healthcare delivery. And they think about this from basically the standpoint of the doctor making referrals, right? That's how the doctor is acting as an agent. They're referring the patient to other doctors, and that's the agency that the doctor provides. All right, so we've talked about this referral issue before, particularly with regard to fee splitting, right? And how if there's fee splitting, then that might alter the decisions of the doctor. And this fee splitting thing is basically very much so a principal agent problem, right? So, very simply, when the doctor agrees to split fees with a referring doctor, the advice from the referring doctor will be distorted. Right. And the reason for that is that there's a financial incentive, right, for the referring doctor. And that financial incentive might override the referring doctor's medical ethics or something like that, right? What they feel is the right thing to do, right? Whatever's right for the patient. So those are kind of the problems, but there is sort of a positive side to this. If the doctor acts as sort of an honest agent, then that can help alleviate problems of asymmetric information, right? So if the doctor is truly acting in the best interest of the patient, then it doesn't matter that there's an information asymmetry between the doctor and the patient. The doctor has the full information, and they're acting on behalf of the best interest of the patient. So those asymmetric information problems will disappear if the doctor is an honest agent, right? If the agent or the doctor provides unbiased advice about medical treatment, particularly regarding referrals, then it doesn't really matter how uninformed the patient might be, because the doctor always provides the right and good advice. But unfortunately, despite this possible silver lining, there's as of yet no contractual agreement that turns all doctors into perfect agents. So um, I don't know if you ever take contract theory. It's very game theory heavy, and it's all about the principal agent problem, and about designing what are called incentive compatible contracts. But it's very difficult to create contracts that force the agent to act perfectly. There's another issue related to this fee splitting idea, and that's the scenario where the doctor refers the patient to a practice that they have a financial interest in. In other words, they're owners of whatever practice or facility that the doctor refers the patient to, right? So the referrals are to independent facilities, but they're not really independent, right? That's why it's in quotes, because the doctor owns a fraction or all of the business that the patient is referred to. So this is kind of like fee splitting, but it's not the same, right? It's just about ownership and who the doctor refers the patient to. So obviously there's going to be some critics of this setup, right? Critics argue that this basically is providing sort of hidden kickbacks, which are explicitly illegal in Medicare and Medicaid, as well as under the specific laws of 26 states. I think it was 26. Let me just double check that. For some reason, I feel like it was 36. That might be a typo. 36. It is a typo. 36 states. But there are proponents of this setup, actually. They argue that this could lead to improved quality of care because of the physician's participation in the independent facility. And it turns out that this practice is very common today. So this is done quite a bit. Now, the nice thing about this is that this isn't something that doctors can hide, like fee splitting. Fee splitting can be hidden. This can't as easily be hidden, right? Typically, the owners of a company are it's public knowledge. Typically, at least if it's an LLC. But anyway, so there have been some studies looking at this issue. There was a study of Florida physicians by Mitchell and Scott, and they found that at least 40% of surveyed doctors were involved in direct patient care had an investment in a healthcare facility which they can refer their patients to. So it's a pretty high proportion. And of those, 40% of that 40%, so I guess 16% overall, of those investments occur in diagnostic imaging centers, to which many types of physicians make referrals. So these are centers that do X-rays or MRIs, right? Those types of medical imaging technologies. So what is the evidence on the consequences of this type of ownership? We'll take a look at that. So Hillman et al. Compared the frequency and costs of radiologic imaging tests among doctors who referred to independent providers, in other words, those that they had no potential financial gain from, versus those who provided the services themselves. And they found that doctors who own imaging machines ordered more than 4 times as many imaging tests as those referring to independent radiologists. Okay, so that seems like induced demand, doesn't it? And on top of that, they charge more than the independent radiologists for similar procedures. So that sounds like induced demand to me. Another study, Mitchell and Sunshine, found that joint ventures served none of the possible positive goals alleged by their supporters. So they did not increase access. They did not increase the amount of quality, but they did increase the amount of services used as well as the cost of care. So pretty much the same findings as the last study. And on top of that, quality was actually lower, not higher. So it seems like the critics might have some more firepower. In another study by Mitchell and Scott, they studied the use, cost, and quality of physician-owned physical therapy centers, so PT. Visits per patient in these centers were 39% higher than in independent facilities. So almost the same number that we saw 2 studies ago, that 40%. They also found that gross revenue, net revenue, and markups were all similarly higher in the physician-owned ventures. Another finding from this study was that licensed physical therapists spent about 60% more time treating their patients than the independent facilities, compared to the physician-owned facilities. So the independent facilities were spending more time with their patients, which we could take as a indication of higher quality, right? So again, those physician-owned facilities provided lower quality than the independent ones. So same findings again. So looking at this evidence, it seems like the profit motive is more powerful than the altruistic motive, right? Either improving access to care or improving quality. So it looks like doctors are inducing demand, right? It's pretty evident here. So what these studies are showing us is the importance of induced demand, particularly in settings where the doctor not only has informational power, but they also have a direct financial reward for recommending a particular treatment to patients. So this is really where induced demand is sort of a problem. All right, there's one last issue we need to discuss. 2 actually. This is the second to last. So we also need to think about the role that consumer information plays when thinking about induced demand. So there have been several studies that have attempted to measure the role of consumer information, and they all compare the rate at which doctors and their families receive medical treatment compared to the general population. So you can see how this is getting at the role of consumer information, right? Comparing doctors and their families. So presumably, if the doctor is part of the family, they have a really good medical knowledge, right? And then compare that to the general public, which the general public has a much lower level of medical information, right? So Bunker and Brown were the first to do this, and they found that doctors and their families received more care than the general population, the control population. And so, it's not exactly, it's not exactly intuitive, right? This finding is not exactly intuitive. You might think that, well, if doctors induce demand and a family that has a doctor in it would know more, then they wouldn't be able to have their demand induced, right? Because they have closer to full information. But what we're finding is that these families and that have doctors in them are spending more money, right? They're receiving more care. So that's kind of counterintuitive, right? Now, unfortunately, this study was pretty flawed. So we can't really take these results with any um, what's the word I'm looking for? Total brain fart. We can't have faith in this result. All right, it turned out that their comparison was flawed, and the main reason it was flawed is that they weren't controlling for things like income, right? So it could be that doctors' families receive more care because they have more money, right? So that's a pretty big flaw. So Hay and Leahy, I think that's how you say that, did a similar comparison, but controlled for insurance coverage and other relevant economic factors like income, using multiple regression. And even though their methods were better, they ultimately found the same thing. Doctors and their families received more care than others. Okay, so even though that last one was flawed, it actually came up with the same conclusion. So this is kind of casting some doubt on the extent to which consumer ignorance plays a role in inducement. But there is still a problem with these studies, and that's that they do not control for the role of what's called professional courtesy. And this is basically free or discounted care, right? So unfortunately, they didn't control for the fact that since these are doctors and their families, they might be receiving discounts, right? Or even free care potentially. Which, of course, if that's the case, that would definitely increase their demand and explain why they receive more care. Um, and so it seems like this might actually be what's driving this result. A study by Levy et al. Revealed that 96% of those surveyed offered professional courtesy to physicians and their families. So most commonly, they billed only the insurance plan. That was 75% of doctors. Almost half of them provided free care, and almost a quarter offered partial discounts. So this is probably what's driving that result, right? Which means that there still may be a role for consumer ignorance, but unfortunately, the evidence so far can't really tell us one way or the other. So the jury is still out here on the role of consumer information. That's the takeaway. Still work to be done there. All right, the last thing to talk about is the role of how physicians are paid, right? The payment structure. So the idea that providers might alter their treatment recommendations on the basis of financial reward is really at the heart of what we're talking about here with induced demand, right? So how they are paid might matter quite a bit. So there was one analysis that was developed, and it developed the ways in which payment methods could alter the treatment recommendation of ethical physicians who knew what the right standard of care was and who had a utility function that included not only their own leisure, but also the provision of appropriate care to their patients. So this is a model, right, development. So this was a model that was developed by Woodward and Warren Bolton. And they consider three different types of payments to physicians. The first was a simple flat annual salary. The second was a time-based wage payment, so something like an hourly wage. And the third was a payment based on the number of procedures performed, which is called fee for service. Fee for service. And they looked at how these different payment schemes affected behavior in their model. And their model had unambiguous predictions. It predicted that the physicians paid by annual salary and time-based wage would deliver less than the right amount of care. They would under provide. but the physicians paid on a fee for procedure basis actually deliver more than the appropriate amount of care, which kind of makes sense, right? If I'm only getting paid when I perform a procedure, I want to perform more procedures, right? So this is pretty common. I mean, this happens in all types of work. You know, you think about the difference between a flat salary versus a hourly wage, for example. Flat salary, you have an incentive to try to work less. So like you'll rush to get your work done, and which means typically the work is of lower quality, because it doesn't matter, you know, how long you spend on the work, you get paid the same amount. And then you have the opposite problem with hourly wages, where you have shirking, right? I'm in no rush to get this work done because the longer it takes me, the more I get paid. So it's kind of similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's, you know, similar types of issues, right? Now, remarkably, there's actually a random control trial experiment that was done testing this precise idea. So that's great, right? We love RCTs, right? Can't get much better than that in terms of experimental precision. So what did they find? Well, first of all, the setup. So their experimental subjects were residents, so newly graduated medical students in their residency, and they were residents in a continuity. I think it was a community care clinic, not continuity. Community care clinic at a university hospital. And the random control part was that randomly selected half the doctors to receive the fee for service payment, and the other half was paid a flat salary. So unfortunately, they didn't look at the hourly wage based payment setup, but they looked at the first and the last one. The patients that were coming into the clinic were also randomized as to which type of doctor they would see. And once they were assigned to a doctor, they were stuck with that doctor for the rest of the period. I guess unless the doctor was not available, in which case they were given a doctor with the same type of payment scheme. And on top of that, so this is all experimental design stuff. On top of that, payments to the doctors were set so that on average, they would basically receive about the same income from the activity, and the profit per patient corresponded to that achieved by physicians in private practice in the community. So, which was about $2 per patient in profit. So, so they're receiving about the same income and compensation as other doctors in the community. And the study directly supported the model, right? Physicians paid on a fee for service basis scheduled more visits per patient compared to the flat salary physicians, and they saw their patients more often. Okay, so that's the exact prediction that the model gave. And almost all of the difference in behavior was due to well care visits, which are just like physicals and checkups, right? So that's where most of the difference came from. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics actually has a published schedule of recommended treatment for children that tries to correspond to the correct amount of care. And doctors on the fee-for-service payment system missed scheduling any of these recommended visits only 4% of the time. So they were pretty close to the recommendation. Whereas doctors on the salary group missed the scheduling recommendations by a higher percentage, 9% of the time. And the difference there between 4 and 9 is statistically significant. And thus the prediction about salary paid doctors providing too little care is supported. Additionally, the fee-for-service doctors scheduled excess WellCare visits beyond the recommendations um, for 22% of their patients, while the salaried doctors only did this 4% of the time. Again, the difference was statistically significant. And this supports the prediction that there's too much care provided by the fee-for-service doctors. Okay, so this model seems like it's working pretty well, right? Okay, one last issue related to payment schemes, and that's changes in procedure reimbursement, right? So this has to do with insurance. So when the doctor performs a procedure, the patient provides their insurance, and then the doctor has to be reimbursed by the insurance company, right? So that's what we're talking about here. So we can learn about the response of doctors to changes in fees paid for specific procedures. So two recent studies did this. They looked at the effects of Medicare fee reforms. So that's something that happens quite frequently, is that Medicare is reformed and there's all kinds of changes to fee reimbursement. This particular change took place in 1990. And the full model suggests that a reduction in fees has two possible consequences. And we've seen these things before. The two possible consequences are that there's an income effect and a substitution effect. So the idea is that physicians prefer more income to less income, but they dislike inducing demand, right? So there's disutility from inducing demand, right? So there's an income and substitution effect going on here. Right? If the fee is reduced, that's a reduction in income, an income effect, but doctors could potentially substitute for this with induced demand, right? To try to boost their incomes back up, but they don't like doing it, right? That's the assumption in the model, is that they feel guilty or something, right? And so they don't like doing it, but they might if the incentive is strong enough, right? So in a refined study of the effects of this change, Nguyen and Derrick looked at the overpriced procedures for which Medicare reduced fees significantly. And so they could tell from this data who was hardest hit in terms of their income as a result of the Medicare changes. And they actually found that there weren't any significant volume changes overall. But when they focused in on the 20% of doctors that were hardest hit, they found a small, but it was significant volume change. And it was an increase in volume. So, a little bit of evidence there, small but statistically significant, but only for those that were hardest hit. In a similar study or a related study, Yip looked at the Medicare fee changes on thoracic surgeons who were predicted to lose over a quarter of their incomes if volume remained unchanged. So the fees were reduced basically by a quarter. And she found that the Medicare fee cut led to volume increases in both Medicare and private pay patients. So that's interesting, right? When Medicare fees were reduced, doctors basically compensated by increasing not only Medicare patients, but also private pay patients. So that's pretty interesting. And this was done to the extent that 70% of the fee loss from Medicare was recaptured. So they were able to recapture 70% of the lost income by increasing volume. All right, so that's a pretty strong indication of induced demand, particularly because of the increase in volume regarding private patients. Okay, that's this chapter. We finally finished it. So just to summarize real quick, what we see here in this chapter is that economic forces direct a lot of the important decisions that doctors make, as well as how they interact with patients, right? So their choice of specialty, location, as well as whether or not they try to induce demand. And the way that prices are set in markets, such as those for physician services, fit well with this monopolistic competition model with incomplete search, right? That's the best model. That seems to be the best model. And the fact that doctors have a price setting power interacts with the possibility of induced demand, right? We see how that those two things work together. But fortunately, there appear to be market forces which limit the actual amount that doctors can induce demand, so that many observable phenomenon actually closely correspond with the predictions of the monopolistic competition model without inducement. So, but there is some strong evidence for inducement as well. So, definitely an interesting area of research. I think that there's some more work to be done there, but that's where we're at. All right. Any questions on this chapter before we move on to chapter 8? Everybody good? Okay, cool. Let's see. Let me switch over to the other PowerPoint here.